Good evening and welcome on behalf of the British-German Association to this evening's event on the NATO at 75 with Ed Arnold, Dr. Aline Matley and Dr. Sorana Christina Jude. Before we begin, my name is Tamara Abele. I am the Program and Membership Lead here at the British-German Association. And before we begin, a quick note on technology. So at the bottom of your screen on the left-hand side, you find the Q&A function. So if you have any questions during the event, please put them in that box and one of the speakers will pick them up during their talk. And if you're joining us tonight for the first time and you would like to support our cause and become a member of the BGA, that's possible with a few clicks on our website, britishgermanassociation.org. I am now handing over to Dr. Sorana Christina Jude, who is a lecturer in Defence Studies at King's College London and the Joint Services Command and Staff College of the Defence Academy of the United Kingdom. She has previously held positions at Newcastle University, including British Academy Postdoctoral Fellow, Lecturer in Politics, and also Teaching Fellow in Politics. Her doctoral dissertation entitled Israel's Military, Emotions, Violence, and the Limits of Dissent was awarded the Best Dissertation Award by the European International Studies Association. And now over to you, Sorana.
Thank you. Thank you, Tamara, very much for introducing me. And it is an absolute pleasure to chair this event and to introduce our distinguished speakers. I will introduce them in the order that they will also speak. So I will start with Dr. Aline Matley, who is a research fellow at the Center for Security and Defense of the German Council of Foreign Relations since March 2022. Previously, she has worked as a deputy head of Konrad Adenauer Foundation Office of Jerusalem. Prior to working in Israel, she was a research associate for the Chair of International Relations and European Politics at the Martin Luther University of Halle-Wittenberg. She also earned her PhD from the same institution with a dissertation on the US impact on NATO and the defense policies of European allies during Obama's presidency. Before her doctoral studies, Dr. Matley studied political science at Zeppelin University of Germany and war studies at King's College London. Ed Arnold is a senior research fellow for European security within the International Security Department of RUSI. His primary research focus is on the transformation of European security following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Specifically, he's interested in the evolving Euro-Atlantic security architecture, the security of Northern Europe, and the UK contribution to European security, particularly NATO or the Joint Expeditionary Force. This is why Ed is a keen observer of the UK national security strategy and the strategic defence and security reviews. Ed joined RUSI from the private sector, where he served as a strategy director within the defense and security sector. Prior to his consultancy career, John was an infantry officer within the British Army. Ed's military career was primarily spent overseas, including deployments to Afghanistan and East Africa, and a posting at the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe during the Ukraine crisis of 2014. Very similar to Dr. Matley, he holds a MA Studies degree from King's College London, and he has a BA International Politics from the University of Stirling. Without further ado, I would like to hand it over to you, Dr. Matley, please.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here on the eve of NATO's summit in Washington, D.C. I'd like to share a few thoughts on some of the specific agenda items that will be shaping the summit and are also reflective of the changed and changing security landscape allies specifically in Europe, are facing. And I'd also like to weave in some comments on potential implications for Germany and its security and defense policy outlook at the same time. I think the three agenda items that will be dominating the summit are the following: responsibility/burden sharing, deterrence and defense plans, and Ukraine and other partnerships. And while not on the official agenda, I think it is also quite important to bear in mind the political context the summit is taking place in, namely debates taking place in the run-up to the presidential election in the host country, the United States. And thus, I think it's important to bear in mind a sense on part of Europeans that NATO ought to be Trump-proofed, or to put it in more diplomatic or polite terms, to be Europeanized. I'm happy to take that up in the discussion if that's of interest to you at all. First of all, though, before turning to the agenda items that I just touched upon, I'd like to offer one short comment on Germany's role in NATO and what the alliance means and has meant to the country in rather general terms. German membership of the NATO alliance is closely, or I'd say very intimately linked to the development of the Federal Republic of Germany after World War II. And even though West Germany only joined the alliance in 1955 and hence is not a founding member of the alliance, NATO subsequently became the most important cornerstone of Germany's security and defense policy, which in my assessment holds true until this very day. And correspondingly, in recent years, Berlin has played or tried to play an increasingly important role in the political and also military positioning and posture of the alliance, especially since 2014, following the illegal annexation of Crimea by Russia, and even more so since 2022. Also, on that point, I'm happy to elaborate further. For the time being, I'd like to focus on the summit and the dominating agenda items, though. The first item on the agenda, which I think is not surprising, is responsibility, aka burden sharing between the US on the one hand and European and Canadian or European allies in Canada on the other hand, and especially with regards to NATO's spending target of 2%. And I think the good news here is that in 2024, 23 out of 32 members will reach this goal, which I think is no coincidence at all, given the anniversary year. NATO is celebrating its 75th anniversary this year. And even more importantly, I would argue we are facing, or the US is facing, presidential elections later on this year in November. And I think NATO, or rather NATO Europeans, will proudly point to the circumstance that an uptick of more than $100 billion US, or 42%, in additional spending can be delineated since 2014 on part of NATO Europe. Germany alone will spend 90.6 billion euros this year on defense, which equals even a bit more than 2%, 2.12% of the country's GDP. On the face of it, that sounds like a major achievement. I would like to add two buts, though. First, this should have happened much, much sooner. Thus, I don't think that other capitals will regard the 2% or Germany reaching the 2% goal as a feat, but rather the bare minimum. Secondly, the composition of the spending is worthwhile examining, as roughly 18 billion euros are drawn from departments other than the defense ministry and are declared as verteidigungsnah, which translates like loosely into contributing to defense. And that includes, for example, interest payments or social benefit payments for soldiers, which in my mind don't contribute to Germany's readiness to fight a war. And all of that just goes to show how desperately Germany tried to reach the goal in NATO's anniversary and US presidential election year. Furthermore, on that note, it will be very difficult for Germany to reach that goal in the years to come, which has been underpinned by recent budget debates in Berlin. Next year, in 2025, only 1.2 billion will be added to the regular defense budget, which will only cover rising personnel costs as far as I'm concerned. Struggling to reach NATO's defense pledge will be problematic, as expectations coming not only from Washington, D.C., but also other European capitals will be to stick to the agreement that was reached last year at the Vilnius summit, that the 2% target is only the floor and not the ceiling. Secondly, the second very important agenda item, which is also connected to the spending target, because for deterrence and defense, you also need money. So the updated deterrence and defense plans that were set in motion already in 2014, but were even put into were put into different shape since 2022, reflecting the changed security environment, will certainly be on the agenda. In this regard, I think it is fair to assume that the assessment of the implementation of the 3 regional plans that were agreed upon at last year's summit in Vilnius, along with the new command and control structure, will be addressed. On that note, apparently around about 500,000 instead of only 300,000 troops are at a high readiness level already, as announced by Secretary General Stoltenberg a few weeks ago as part of NATO's force model, and thus the alliance's military transformation that has been set in motion a few years ago. I have my doubts about whether that will be about that being actually sort of being feasible to achieve, especially with regard to Germany, as it is still not clear whether Berlin will be able to send a battle-ready brigade of about 5,000 soldiers to Lithuania in time, that being by the end of 2027. So, and in that respect, we're talking about 5,000 troops, and Germany has agreed to contribute more than 30,000 troops to the NATO force model. So I'm not quite sure how Germany will be able to square that circle. Additionally, and sort of compounding that issue, personnel demands with regard to Germany are much higher than expected, as recently reported. Around about 75,000 additional soldiers are needed in order to meet NATO expectations and in order to meet what Germany has promised NATO to deliver. At the same time, the Bundeswehr, Germany's armed forces, are shrinking, not only with regards to personnel demands. And thirdly, Ukraine and other partnerships, mainly countries in the Indo-Pacific, the so-called IP4, but also others. On Ukraine, I think it is by now safe to say that no invitation will be extended to Ukraine to join the alliance anytime soon. That is partly due to pressure from Berlin. Hence, there are not that many meaningful deliverables left to offer short of alliance membership. Thus, I think it is likely that we will see an emphasis on the new NATO mission, or rather, and that's the official name, NATO Security Assistance and Training for Ukraine, as Germany insisted on not calling the activity NATO Mission Ukraine, to convey that the engagement is not about that the engagement is only about security support, i.e. coordination of arms deliveries and training activities for Ukraine's armed forces, and not about NATO forces becoming involved in Ukraine proper. In addition, it is already clear that NATO will station a senior civilian official in Kiev, and it seems fairly likely that in the final summit communique, Ukraine's membership will be termed irreversible in order to offer something more to Ukraine. And supposedly, allies have agreed to set aside about 40 billion euros for Ukraine's military aid for next year. All of that is supposed to serve as a sort of bridge for Ukraine's path into NATO, short of outlining when exactly that moment will arrive, if ever, I would add. But I'm also happy to take that up in the discussion. On the Indo-Pacific partners, again, it's very unlikely, and it seems safe to assume that we will not see the announcement of the opening of a NATO liaison office in Tokyo, which was already a bone of contention at last year's summit. Rather, I'm assuming that we will see an emphasis on common values, but also activities such as cyber defense and non-proliferation. The implications for Germany with regards to Ukraine's support are such that the expectations that are already very high at the moment will only continue to rise due to a number of factors, not least the prospect of the United States lowering its support to Ukraine. At the same time, it remains to be seen what Germany is and will be willing to deliver on that front, also in light of the budgetary restrictions domestically and the sort of the fight over the next annual budget that I touched upon a bit earlier. With regards to the Indo-Pacific, I think Germany will want to continue a sort of balancing act between showing support for the so-called IP4 and other partner countries in the region like the Philippines, and not only showing verbal support, but also continuing to engage in activities with those countries, like-minded countries. And at the same time, trying not to antagonize China unnecessarily as viewed from Germany, especially the Chancellery. On that last point regarding the Indo-Pacific, and in conclusion, despite Germany's increased involvement in the Indo-Pacific, which I think is likely to increase further in coming years, it is safe to assume that the main priority of German security and defense policy, and thus German NATO policy, is and remains the Euro-Atlantic area. And this focus is congruent with the expectations of the alliance partners for Germany to play a more prominent leading role in the alliance framework. European allies and the US have for years now expected Germany to play a more prominent role in NATO in line with its political but also economic heft. And this is an expectation that Germany has repeatedly tried to meet, sometimes successfully, but at times Germany's security and defense policy, especially within the NATO framework, falls short of the ambitions it has set for itself and those it has received from the outside, namely its NATO allies. And on that note, I would like to conclude my initial remarks. Thank you very much for your attention and bearing with me. I look forward to the discussion. And of course, Ed's remarks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Matle. I already have a few questions, and I look forward to the Q&A session. So Ed, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And also thank you for the invitation to speak. I'm not entirely sure if it was really well planned that we decided to talk about NATO and the UK and Germany just a couple of days after our new Foreign Secretary made his first trip to Berlin. I'm not sure if that counted as one of the strategic dialogues that was set up between the UK and Germany since 2021, and we had a recent one when Lord Cameron also came over, but it actually follows quite a lot of deliberate UK policy in terms of defence and security. I mean, partly the first trip for His Majesty the King was also to Berlin, but work that I've been doing a lot on over the last 2 years is specifically around UK-German cooperation, which I think Eileen did a lot in terms of the agenda items, so I don't have to sort of focus on that, but sort of I'll speak a little bit about the UK, but also the options potentially for closer UK and German cooperation within the NATO framework. There's been reports within the UK that also there's a chance for a bilateral treaty-based relationship with the UK and Germany sooner than potentially expected. Initially, it was within 6 months, but I've also heard reports that it could be as early as 18th of July for the European Political Community Summit within the UK. And this is very much in line with the new government's policy of a reconnection, now wording slightly changed to reset of relations with Europe. And I really think these two things go hand in hand. So a more positive relationship with Germany also goes hand in hand with a better UK-EU relationship, especially on defence and security. So that's the sort of the first part. I think in terms of where the UK goes now, I mean, there's a lot that we still don't know because the government was only sworn in effectively on Friday and then straight off to a NATO summit. And, you know, you've seen that the Foreign Secretary and the Defence Secretary have been very, very busy travelling. But I'd sum it up broadly as continuity rather than change in quite a lot of regards there. I think the Euro-Atlantic will still absolutely be the cornerstone of UK defence and security policy within that NATO primacy. So, you know, described as an unshakable commitment to NATO and also the nuclear deterrent. The defence spending in terms of the 2%, we have been consistently just over for a long time, but also have similar ways of making up that number that has already been outlined. But there's an aspiration to 2.5% by 2030. Effectively, what the new government is saying is that they have to have a fiscal event, so a budget, before they can start to understand what that looks like. So at the moment, it's still an aspiration, not a commitment. And also within that, in terms of what the UK spends, we're also been consistently meeting the 20% new equipment target as well. And again, I doubt that is going to change much. So why, you know, NATO primacy? I think also from the current Labour position, they have made a lot of defence and security and been stronger on defence and security than under the previous leadership recently. And very much setting it in the foundations, because it's the Labour government that were there that actually did a lot to set up NATO again. And I think we'll hear a lot of sort of messaging on that around the summit. But also when you look at the UK and Germany specifically with the NATO context, which I've been doing for a couple of years now, I mean, it's pretty clear that objectives are very, very similar. You know, the UK and Germany are the two top European defence spenders in NATO, although that's recently flipped, but we're still the top two, but UK is now second. Also, top two European supporters of Ukraine when you measure it in terms of military, economic and humanitarian assistance. The primacy of NATO and that transatlantic security outlook is absolutely fundamental to both countries. The UK and Germany have the ambition to fight at the divisional level within NATO. There's issues over when the single division on the UK side and both divisions on the German side will be ready, but it is a commitment that we both make. We also both lead Framework Nations concepts from 2014 about looking at enhancing European capabilities and capacities at the regional level. the heavyweights of cooperation in the Sky Shield initiative. We're also very high readiness task force, now allied reaction force framework nations, and also contribute to Baltic air policing. We're both multinational battle group leads and coordinated initially on brigade headquarters, and now Germany's made the commitment to a brigade within Lithuania. The UK still sort of, exercising at a brigade level, but not yet making that commitment. And in terms of readiness, although I think there's issues within both forces, Germany first and then the UK very quickly were the first two to commit forces to the new force model. So within that context, I think that there is a lot that the UK, Germany can do within NATO, and equally that they might have to do based on the US presidential election at the end of the year, that if it goes the way that I think most Europeans are hoping it doesn't go, the requirements for leadership within Europe will rise pretty significantly, and that will fall disproportionately on the shoulders of particularly the UK, Germany, and other nations. So how both countries sort of embrace that effectively will really have an impact on where NATO goes following the end of this year. Where's NATO at the moment going into the summit? I think the summit itself, there's been a lot of expectation management after Vilnius a year ago, particularly around Ukrainian membership of NATO. It's really a difficult position holding that unity, because the main change that we've seen in the last 12 months is that the balance on the ground is fundamentally worse than it was 12 months ago. And that's ultimately the backdrop. We obviously saw the pretty horrible scenes today where further strikes on Kyiv, including 2 medical facilities. So that's going to be very, very difficult for this unity to hold because of the issue on Ukraine and having no invitation. And I think really this is a bit of a missed opportunity for NATO, because with all of the political changes that we're seeing within Europe, I think we were probably never in a better position over the last couple of years to get ratification through national parliaments, which will only get more and more difficult. When we talk about the irreversible language, the only thing really is an invite under Article 10 of the Washington Treaty, because an invite actually can't be revoked once provided. And it also doesn't mean that Ukraine will join immediately. And nations who are more concerned about Ukraine joining could effectively demonstrate that through the ratification process under Article 11. But what it would mean that it is actually something that Ukraine can be provided, more substantively than semantic changes, and we'll see what happens within the communique. And it's also democratic. You saw this in the UK in terms of ratification over Sweden and Finland recently, that under our national constitution, it should take 21 days. And we did it in a single day to show that commitment. And I really do think people will look back and say that an invitation could have been potentially made, because ultimately NATO's always been reactive to Russia, not proactive. NATO has never held the initiative in regards to Ukraine. And I speak about that like last time when I was a NATO officer. I was at SHAPE in 2014 when Crimea happened. And again, since then, NATO has always been reactive to how Russia is looking at it. And then also just to sort of finish, doing some work recently on NATO, we always describe it as the most successful military alliance in history. And there is a lot to back that up. It's the world's first ever nuclear alliance. Membership has grown 167% over 10 enlargement rounds. And there's more demand, more people want to join. And, in this 75th year, its security umbrella covers a large amount of territory, a large population's collective GDP is significant. So there's a lot to be said that NATO is the most successful military alliance in history. However, I find it quite difficult to attribute success to NATO as an organization, or some of that success, rather than the US as the superpower member. And this is where it will get quite interesting going forward in terms of the US commitment to NATO in the future. I'm not just talking about this election, but actually more elections to come. As I've already mentioned, I mean, NATO really got Russia wrong, and I think it's got Russia wrong for quite a long time now. And if you look at the main military operations that NATO has actually undertaken, so mainly in Bosnia and Kosovo, Operation Deliberate Force and Operation Allied Force, respectively, they were very small operations. They're very small operations that a alliance of the size of NATO really should have been able to deal with on their own. And actually a lot of that was the US, the UK and France. And then Operation Unified Protector over Libya in 2011 was not a success from a NATO position, and the International Security Assistance Force Resolute Support Mission in Afghanistan, speaking as an Afghanistan veteran, I'd say was a total failure. So actually, when you look at it from a military perspective, NATO has not performed very well, and going forward in terms of defense and deterrence, NATO can't afford to not have that military operation succeed. So where should the focus be? I think I've already mentioned maintaining unity, spending more, but also spending better. I think a real focus on societal resilience. This is done mainly at the national level, but from a NATO perspective, I think they need to really start to look at it at a multilateral level. NATO forces really need to prepare for war, not just on paper, but in terms of that sort of will to fight and the moral component of fighting power. Like I've said, in terms of those NATO operations over the last sort of 2 decades have been very, very different. And also, finally, communicate the benefits to the public. And that really starts at the NATO summit this year. And with that, I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This was really insightful, fascinating talks and topics for sure. May I invite our audience to start typing their questions in the chat, and I will pick up on them, or we'll keep an eye on the chat, but also our speakers are more than welcome if they see a question and they want to answer it. So while we're waiting for our questions in the chat, I will just obviously abuse my position as a chair, and just a question whether you could say a few words, both of you, on the possible impact of Trump presidency on NATO, and actually what would this mean for Germany and UK? I mean, it's becoming very clear that US will withdraw from NATO. This is not only on the Republican side, but having a look at the media, the Democratic side is also shifting towards. So is this an opportunity for UK and Germany to become the leaders in European security? What do you think?
Shall I go first? Okay. Well, first off, I think it's very clear that Europeans wish that Biden will be reelected for the obvious reason that he is at least more predictable than Trump. At the same time, I think there are markers that we can turn to in order to at least deduce some assumptions, some possible policies that Trump will implement if re-elected. And one of those concepts that has been floating around for the past couple of weeks, if not months, is dormant NATO, which has been produced by people that are close to or are said to be close to Trump. And I think that is something, well, so sort of at the heart of it, the concept the concept suggests that NATO European allies should take up the majority of conventional deterrence in NATO, and at the same time, the US will remain to engage in the nuclear deterrent component, especially via the nuclear sharing component and extended deterrence component. I think it is not unlikely that we will see those kinds of demands being put in front of European allies if Trump will be re-elected. What will a Trump presidency or a Trump 2.0 presidency mean for Germany? I think, again, not the best outcome, not something that German policymakers and decision makers are hoping for. I think that's quite obvious. At the same time, I would hope that they are more and better prepared than the last time, because now at least there are indicators, there are markers that policymakers in Germany, but also other European capitals can turn to in order to prepare better, in order to have a better sense of how to engage a second Trump administration. And I think while Germany is well advised to continue focusing on reaching the 2% goal, I'm not quite sure whether that will satisfy Trump because of his sort of erratic style of politics, but also because of for some reason that, at least in some respects, escapes me, he has headed out for Germany during his first presidency, partly for sort of justified reasons, because Germany committed to the 2% already in 2014, or at least working towards reaching that goal until 2024. So there was justified criticism coming from Trump, but then I think there are also reasons that that escape me, why he's so focused on Germany. So in some, I think Germany can at least do, or by doing its homework, for example, reaching the 2% goal, but also, and that I think is very important to underline, to actually to fulfill the promises it has made in the NATO framework. Ed mentioned the 2 divisions, for example, that Germany is now supposed to have in place by 2025 and 2027, which is really a tall order for Germany's armed forces. And even the chief of armed forces of the army in Germany has cast his doubts about whether Germany will actually reach that next year and then into 2027. So I think by ways of following up on what the country promises, has promised the United States to deliver, but NATO to deliver in order to bolster European security and European defense, I think could help to sort of to leave Trump with less reasons to criticize and to attack Germany.
Thank you. Ed, would you like to pitch in, please?
Yes, I think while we're all obviously focused on the US presidential election, hugely consequential for a variety of reasons, and in the UK policymaking scene, I think, yes, there is also a strong preference for Biden, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the Europeans get a get out of jail free card. I mean, the Europeans still need to do more. The US are still going to, get more distracted in the Indo-Pacific and gradually move over more forces east. So we've got to do this anyway. So we kind of may as well get on with it. And I think we talk a bit about sort of which frameworks organizations are best placed to do that. I mean, it is NATO. At the moment, it is NATO. So, and also there's other things that are complementary to it. So it is a bit frustrating where we sort of tried to find the problem lots instead of just sort of moving forward. I think there's 2 issues though in terms of the US and a potential Trump presidency, and Eileen mentioned it, it's the predictability. And, in some ways, I think that their second Trump presidency might not be as bad in terms of regard of what he said about NATO. But the other issue is we don't know. And policymakers like consistency. And that's the real difficulty. I think the way that the US may disengage from Europe under a Trump presidency will be quicker, and it will also probably be much worse communicated to the Europeans. And we saw that a little bit with the NATO withdrawal from Afghanistan as well, where the US just had their policy first under Trump and then Biden, and they just enacted it. Didn't really sort of explain it to NATO very well until it was sort of effectively happening, and it meant that the Europeans couldn't give a response. The risk is there, though, that while the Europeans have not spent well on defence, we've also not invested in enablers, and the US has. So logistics in particular, air-to-air refueling, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, particularly assets that can fly up in the north. And this is a real issue for the Europeans because, yes, we're spending more on defence and all looks impressive on paper. But if we also then actually have to divert a lot of those resources to spending money on really expensive enablers and not combat capability, then actually European combat capability might not increase that much. I think the other issue that I think NATO has to contend with, and this is pretty critical for the UK and Germany, bearing in mind where we sit in the alliance command structure and also the ability to fight at the divisional level, although obviously caveats that were both mentioned on the time, is that I don't think the US will fight in a NATO command structure. I think the US will see NATO as slowing it down if they had to do in terms of an Article 5 full war scenario. And that might actually be quite uncomfortable for Europeans. I think the US will fight alongside NATO until a point in time, and then the whole operation might come under a NATO command structure. That's going to be very, very difficult to actually how we think we may fight. So I think this is the issue with the new regional and transatlantic reinforcement plans, that they need to be better communicated, because at the moment there are classified documents of 4,000 words or so, 4,000 pages, so great, but everyone, like myself included, want to know a little bit more of the detail to us actually understand how this is going to operate. And then specifically in terms of the UK, I mean, the UK can act as a backstop for the US within NATO to a certain degree. Yes, we are one of two European nuclear powers, but we do have our forces already assigned to NATO. There are certain things that we can do in terms of intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, which could plug some gaps, but I ultimately think it's going to be far more difficult. And in terms of NATO's sort of what we call a 360-degree approach to security, both in domains and geographies, that was agreed at the 2016 Warsaw Summit, I think the US broadly assures that approach, which is more political rather than having a military logic. So if you actually take away the US sort of leadership in terms of the glue around NATO, I think the way that NATO will have to move to is actually far more regionalization than it has done in the past. I think you get pockets of regionalization, but politically, for a variety of reasons, people don't want regional blocks within NATO. But you've got to now ask yourself the question, well, fighting in the high north and the Arctic is very difficult than fighting in the Mediterranean, and maybe we should properly recognize that. And equally, in terms of capabilities, regional expertise, why not look at that model? And NATO used to have that. It's in the first strategic concept under the regional planning groups. So actually, if we look at it more on a regional basis, and whereby countries like the UK, Germany, Poland, France, Spain, Italy could actually step up and lead in certain areas and actually create that cohesive whole without the US, or without, with the US being a bit distracted. I think that is potentially a model that NATO will have to look at, but it'll be a more fundamental change if the US does disengage under a most sort of dangerous scenario. I think the worst thing would be for NATO to sort of try and just carry on business as usual. We can keep going without sort of that US engagement. I think it actually would have to transform more as an organization than it probably thinks it needs to. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, actually, this speaks very nicely to the questions that are coming in, and maybe just pick on a question on, because both of you spoke a little bit about Ukraine, and Ukraine will be on the agenda, and it's worth picking up on one of the questions that just came up, and one of our audience members says, it was reported in the German press recently that European NATO allies will be taking over the coordination of security assistance and training to Ukraine from the US, as announced at a meeting of NATO defense ministers last month. This is surely a crucial step towards Trump-proofing NATO support for Ukraine. How ready are Germany and the UK and other partners to take on this coordination role? So, should we go to Eileen to see whether the contribution from NATO allies to support training of Ukraine through?
Sure. I mean, I suppose that the news report refers to the new NATO mission that has been agreed upon just a few weeks ago. And it's my understanding that the headquarters of that mission is to be located in Wiesbaden, where the base of US forces Europe is also located, and that base was in charge of coordinating weapons supplies in the so-called Rammstein format thus far. And it's furthermore, it is also my understanding that while many Europeans will contribute to that coordination team, there will still be US American staff as well coming from NATO. I understand that the idea behind moving it under the NATO framework is to quote unquote Trump-proof the alliance, and especially the alliance's support to Ukraine. I mean, how ready is Germany to play a more leading role in that regard? I don't think that's, I mean, yes, that is part of making sure that we see a continuation with regards to supporting Ukraine. But I think there are other points, other markers that we should also bear in mind when it comes to assessing the success of supporting Ukraine, or the failure of supporting Ukraine, especially in military terms. And that comes back to the weapons systems that are delivered to Ukraine, which I understand is also part of, or the coordination of those deliveries is part of the job of that new mission. And in that respect, and I think Ed mentioned it already, the UK and Germany are, at least in absolute terms, the two biggest supporters of Ukraine in the EU / Europe respectively, only sort of following the US lead so far. And I think Germany is trying its best to continue living up to those expectations, trying to continue supporting Ukraine. But again, as I mentioned before, Germany needs money to do that, and the German armed forces are increasingly being hollowed out because the systems that have been donated to Ukraine that came directly from the German armed forces have not been replenished in the numbers that are necessary in order to live up to the expectations and to the promises and pledges that Germany made in the NATO context. So in sum, I think as long as we don't see a significant increase in Germany's defense spending, Germany will continue to sort of manage walking a balancing act between continuing to support Ukraine on the one hand, not only rhetorically, but also militarily, and on the other hand, making sure that it is continuing to move along on the trajectory that NATO has been on since 2022, and to continue bolstering NATO's updated defense and deterrence plans, which Germany is contributing to, for example, in Lithuania with the promise and the prospect of a permanently stationed brigade, for example. So I don't think that we will see. What we will see are more expectations on Germany. I'm not quite sure whether Germany will be able to live up to those expectations. And just one last thought on also circling back, Sorana, to your question on whether the UK and Germany are ready to take on a leadership role for Europe in case of a reduced attention on part of the US on Europe. I think alone they won't be able to do that, and I don't think that especially Germany is even trying to fill out the US's shoes. I mean that would be completely ridiculous, even for all Europeans taken together. But I think what Germany is definitely aspiring to do, and that we could also witness over the past couple of months, is to sort of to revive the Weimar Triangle, consisting of France, Poland, and Germany. And I think, Ed, you mentioned that in the context of a missed opportunity with regard to Ukraine, I think the prospects of the Weimar Triangle living up to its full potential, plus the UK, adding the UK to that trilateral partnership, have never been as good maybe not never, but at least in a very long time, we're seeing a also a possible momentum for those four countries to move European defense along, as we haven't in a very long time.
I think you're absolutely right, and the leadership, there's kits and capabilities questions, but ultimately I always come back to this leadership question that no one country or group of countries can replicate the US leadership that we see within European security or within NATO. So that shouldn't be the goal. The goal, it will probably be far more modest, and groups like the Weimar Triangle, also the E3 between Germany, France, UK, there's a lot of other options, but I think we need to be very clear about sort of what the aims and objectives are and almost sort of work back from that. I think the problem is that some of these concepts are so ill-defined: Europeanization of NATO, European sovereignty, etc. We get too worried about the sort of the process rather than what we actually might need to achieve. And Europeans are going to be worried about it quite a lot. And I think in terms of the US electoral system and the, having 2 months of transition period, I think that is really the point whereby Europeans might have to say, well, we do need to do a lot of things differently here and sort of get a bit of momentum around it. I mean, coordination is really important. And actually, I think coordination on training is one of the more important aspects of it, because when you look at both the Ukrainian and Russian military, I mean, huge losses on both sides. But the real issue is that the Russians have also lost their ability to train their own troops. And that is why we're seeing the tactics that they employ, which, for the last couple of months, I mean, in terms of killed and wounded in action, they're losing almost a battle group a day. That is pretty significant. And while they can sort of regenerate that combat power in terms of people and weapons, they can't, at this point, unless they can train and actually train at a higher echelon, their offensive potential is still going to be pretty poor. On the Ukrainian side, they have similar challenges, but the one aspect that they do have is that they have trainers from a variety of NATO countries and a variety of missions that are able to train. The issue is the need is so important at the moment that troops are only getting sort of 5 weeks of training before they're sent to the front line, and crudely put, it's effectively so that they win their first engagement or survive their first engagement and sort of learn on the job, which is not great. And the average age of people going through the UK system, I mean, of Ukrainian recruits is around 43. So it's, this is pretty difficult because the need is so great. I think what NATO could do and structuralize proper training. So it's not just in terms of combat capability, it's about headquarters staff. Because at the moment, again, this war is fought below a battle group level. Battle groups are engaged, but they're not fighting as battle groups. They're effectively fighting as separate company groups. And that is not going to give you the offensive potential to achieve objectives on either side. Coordination of equipment as well. So training's much easier. We've been doing that for a long time, but I mean, NATO has had standardization programs for 30 years, and we still operate 17 main battle tanks over in Europe and about 147, I think, sort of distinct weapons platforms. So we've done quite a lot, but we need to do more. And can we do that now? Possibly, but we're going to have to really speed up the tempo if the election goes sort of the wrong way for Europe at the end of the year.
Thank you. Time is running quickly, and we have about 3 minutes left, 2 minutes and a half. And I wonder whether you have any final thoughts on the questions that have been coming in. I like very much that Eileen mentioned, the Weimar Triangle or a revived Weimar Triangle. It's quite interesting because it speaks to an interesting question on EU strategic sovereignty. What's the role for the EU in this context? Quite interesting. And also there's a question on how to achieve greater integration, and this is what Ed has mentioned earlier. So I wonder whether you have any final thoughts on EU strategic sovereignty being back on the table or on greater integration within NATO?
I can go first. I think we should stop distracting ourselves here in Europe with fancy names, whether it's European sovereignty, whether it's European autonomy. I think that is really beside the point. What we should focus on instead is generating, and that, and Ed outlined that beautifully earlier, on generating capabilities and making sure that we are interoperable and that we as Europeans, whether that is in groups of countries or whether that is as NATO, Europe in its entirety, be able to, well, first off, continue working towards deterring Russia, but making sure that if that fails, that we're ready to fight back, and that we are ready to defend NATO territory. And one very last thought, and I think that I should have mentioned that before when you asked about the prospects of a Trump presidency. Ed has touched upon the fact that it's not just about Trump, or maybe I don't want to put words into your mouth, but that was my understanding, and that actually that is something that I share. We shouldn't only be focusing and be fixated on Trump. Because if you read the latest national security strategy that was published by the US in October 2022, under the current Biden administration, it is very clear that, and I think that's actually that's the term they are using, China is the pacing threat. In other words, the focus, the number one priority is not going to be Russia, but China. So either way, I mean, yes, there will be differences, there will be nuances, whether it's Trump or Biden or a third person we don't know about yet. I mean, that's also still still being debated whether Biden will actually run. However, regardless of whether a Republican or a Democrat will be residing in the White House from January 2025 onwards, Europeans have to focus much more on actually Europeanizing NATO, regardless of whether they call it European autonomy or European sovereignty.
Very quickly on the integration question, and yes, I mean, one way of looking at it is between the UK and Germany, it amounts to sort of a pioneer company, but the other way of looking at it is actually it's NATO bridging. capability and asset. It's pretty much the only one. It's kind of worrying when you look at it about that, but it's not just about sort of the capabilities. The other thing, which sort of is about political integration, etc., that allies can keep each other honest, and there's a lot of benefits to that in the terms of UK, Germany, of saying, well, we're fighting at the divisional level. You've committed to one in 2025, 2030. Like, where is it? Pushing for it, defense spending again, keep on increasing it. So I think there's a lot that Europeans will need to do that sort of in the future. And I do think UK and Germany and some others are pretty important on that, as you see the drive for support to Ukraine, principally by the Baltic nations. When you look at what they're sending by percentage of GDP, it's pretty important. And also some of the capability that sort of Sweden's sending fairly recently, and also look at what the Danes and the Dutch, as smaller European nations, are spending. It's pretty impressive. So when you actually look at those combined and say, well, actually, if there's countries that are doing this type of activity and pushing, then the larger nations should too, and sort of move in that sort of general direction. I just think it's a speed issue now, that actually, if from a US perspective, that the Europeans are gonna have to do this at a much quicker rate than they have been previously. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Eileen. So before I hand over to Tamara, once again, I would like to say a big thank you to our distinguished speakers. I've really enjoyed today's event, but most of all to all the questions that came through the chat. And I think it was well worth to finish a bit later. This is such a fascinating topic. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for joining us tonight, Sorana, Ed, and Eileen, and everyone at home. So we hope to see you soon at one of our upcoming events, probably in autumn. And yeah, thank you very much. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Bye.